When that electric blue luxury SUV first came barreling down the narrow, gravel spine of Blackwood Ridge, kicking up enough dust to choke a timber wolf, my old man, we call him Silas, just sat there on his rusted tailgate, calmly peeling an apple like the world wasn't ending, and he looked at me with those squinted, weather-beaten eyes and said, and quote, "Son, you're looking at a woman who brought a legal brief to a fist fight with Mother Nature, and the trees dawn and oppos. Too much care for paperwork." End quote. We've been out there since sunrise, fixing the fence line on land that's been in our name since before the Great Depression, a patch of wilderness so thick and deep that the GPS usually just gives up and dies, but apparently the reach of a suburban homeowners association knows no bounds, and that morning, a woman named Patricia Thorne, the kind of person who treats a Starbucks order like a federal mandate, decided our family sanctuary was actually just an, end quote, unregulated extension, end quote, of her manicured subdivision 5 miles down the valley. She stepped out of that vehicle in white designer sneakers that had no business touching real dirt, waving a smartphone like it was a holy relic, and before she even reached the shade of our old hickory tree, she was screaming about, end quote, visual aesthetics, end quote, and, end quote, non-compliant structures, end quote, pointing her manicured finger at our deer blind like it was a festering wound on her personal horizon. My dad didn't even stand up. He just took a slow bite of that apple, watched a drop of juice run into his gray beard, and said in that low, gravelly rumble of his, end quote, "Mind oppos, unless you're here to help us clear these fallen pines, you're about 4 miles deep into a conversation you haven't earned the right to have," end quote. But Patricia wasn't into oppos. Listening. She was too busy tapping on a digital map, claiming that a recent, end quote, fringe expansion, end quote, of the Oak Creek Estates gave her the authority to regulate the, end quote, viewshed, end quote, of the entire ridge, and right then, as she slapped a bright orange, end quote, notice of violation, end quote, onto the rough-cut cedar of our shed, I saw a look in Silas's eyes that I hadn't seen in 20 years, a quiet, flickering ember of a man who spent his life respecting boundaries and expected the same in return. She spent 15 minutes lecturing us on, end quote, community standards, end quote, her voice getting higher and more nasal with every word, talking about how our woodpile was an eyesore and our fire pit was a, end quote, geological hazard, end quote, and when she finally huffed back to her SUV, muttering about, end quote, legal injunctions, end quote, and, end quote, enforcement protocols, end quote, she threw that luxury tank into reverse so fast she clipped the edge of a heavy limestone boulder we use as a boundary marker, sending her iced latte flying across her dashboard like a beige explosion, and I couldn't into oppos. To help it, I let out a bark of a laugh that echoed through the pines, watching her windshield wipers desperately try and smear the foam away as she sped off. Silas just watched the dust settle, his face as unreadable as a mountain, and he reached into the bed of the truck, pulling out a heavy, wooden crate that smelled of old motor oil and cold iron, and inside were these massive 16-inch railroad spikes, rusted to a deep, blood-orange hue, the kind of steel that's designed to hold a continent together, and he just started sharpening the tips with a hand file. The sound of metal on metal singing a high, lonesome tune through the trees. I asked him what he was doing, thinking maybe he was just blowing off steam, but he looked at me and said, and quote, "Gideon, some people don an oppos to understand where their world ends and mine begins until they feel the edge of it. And if Patricia wants to treat this trail like her private driveway, she's going to learn real quick that the mountain has teeth." End quote. The next few days were a blur of, end quote, guerrilla hospitality, end quote, as Silas called it, because we knew she'd be back. People like Patricia can't stand being told, end quote, no, end quote, by a man in a flannel shirt. So we spent the moonlit hours at the entrance of the ridge, a place we call the Devil's Elbow, where the road dips and curves behind a thicket of mountain laurel. We didn't do anything illegal, or at least that's what Silas told himself. We just, end quote, reinforced the natural topography, end quote, by burying those spikes in a staggered pattern just off the main tire ruts, covering them with a light dusting of pine needles and damp earth until the trap was as invisible as a copperhead in the leaves. Sure enough, that Saturday afternoon, we heard the whine of a high-performance engine screaming up the incline, And Patricia came charging in like she was leading a cavalry charge, probably coming to serve us with those, in quote, injunctions, in quote, she'd been bragging about. But when she hit the elbow, we heard it, a sound like a gunshot echoing through the valley, the unmistakable thwack hiss of $3,000 in Oppos, worth of run-flat tires meeting 60 years of industrial-grade American steel. She didn't even make it to the camp. Her SUV just slumped into the mud like a wounded beast, and when she stepped out, her face was a shade of purple I didn't know humans could turn, screaming about, in quote, sabotage, in quote, and in quote, domestic terrorism, in quote, into a cell phone that had 0 bars of service because, out here, the only thing that connects is the wind and the silence. Silas walked out from behind the shed, holding a thermos of black coffee, looking as surprised as a man watching the sun rise, and he said, and quote, trouble with the commute, Patricia? I told you that road wasn't Oppos. T-rated for city tires, and quote. And when she started threatening to call the National Guard, he just pointed to a small, laminated sign we'd tucked into the trees that morning which read caution, unmaintained logging route. Enter at own risk, and he smiled a slow, dangerous grin and told her that if she wanted a tow, she'd have to wait until Monday because the only guy with a winch in this county was his cousin Miller, and Miller was currently, in quote, indisposed and, quote, at a fishing tournament. She ended up having to hike 3 miles back to the main road in those designer shoes, her heels snapping off in the soft clay, and, as I watched her limp away, I realized this wasn't Oppos. T just about a trail anymore. It was a war of worlds, the paved world of rules and committees versus the dirt world of sweat and heritage. And Patricia wasn't Oppos. T the type to surrender. She was the type to escalate. 2 weeks later, the, end quote, Patricia problem, in quote, went digital as she launched a full-scale smear campaign on the local, in quote, Nextdoor, in quote, app and Facebook, posting photos of our deer blind and calling it a, in quote, militia compound, in quote, we're, in quote, dangerous radicals, in quote, we're, in quote, trapping innocent hikers, in quote, which was news to us since the only hikers we'd seen in a decade were lost tourists looking for the nearest gas station. She even managed to convince a young, overeager deputy named Vance to come out and, in quote, investigate, in quote, us for, in quote, public endangerment, in quote. But when Vance showed up and saw Silas, who used to be the county and Oppos' lead fire chief, he just sighed and shook his head, telling us that he had to file a report because Patricia was, in quote, making a hell of a noise at the station, end quote. But he whispered to me that his own mother had been kicked out of Patricia's HOA for having the, end quote, wrong shade of mulch, end quote. But Patricia had a new toy, a high-end surveillance drone that started buzzing over our cabin at all hours. This white mechanical hornet that felt like an invasion of the one place we felt safe. So my younger brother Caleb, who's got the aim of a hawk and the patience of a stone, spent 3 hours in the canopy of an old oak tree with a heavy-duty fishing net and a telescopic pole. And when that drone dipped just a little too low to get a, end quote, compliance shot, end quote, of our vegetable garden, Caleb swiped it right out of the air like a giant butterfly. Patricia showed up an hour later, hysterical, screaming that we'd, end quote, stolen federal property, end quote, but Silas just handed her a bag of broken plastic and told her he thought it was a giant Japanese beetle attacking his tomatoes. And out here, a man's got a right to defend his crops from invasive species. The conflict hit a fever pitch when Patricia decided that if she couldn't in Oppos, sue us out, she'd, end quote, annex, end quote, us by force of infrastructure, showing up on a Tuesday morning with a rented flatbed truck and 2 confused-looking contractors, intending to install a, end quote, community gateway, end quote, across our entrance, essentially a motorized gate that would lock us out of our own property. I watched from the porch as Silas didn't, in Oppos, to even grab a gun. He just grabbed a dusty, leather-bound folder from the safe and walked down that trail with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. And he didn't, in Oppos. T yell. He didn't, in Oppos. T scream. He just opened that folder and showed the contractors the original 1924 deed, complete with the county's official wax seal and a topographical map that showed the, end quote, community line, end quote, ended exactly 400 yards before our gate. The contractors, seeing they were about to get sued into the Stone Age for trespassing, packed up their tools and left before Patricia could even finish her opening remarks about improving property values leaving her standing in the middle of our dirt road, holding a clipboard like a shield, while Silas just leaned in and said, Patricia, you spent so much time looking at maps on a screen that you forgot to look at the ground beneath your feet. This land doesn't. And Oppos, T belonged to a committee. It belongs to the people who bleed for it. And the next time you cross that line, I want an Oppos. T be showing you paperwork, I an Oppos. LL be showing you why they call this place Blackwood. But the final boss move from Patricia was something we didn't in Oppos. TC coming. She hired a small-time investigative YouTuber to film a segment on rural hostility trying to paint us as some kind of backwoods cult, and they showed up with cameras rolling, trying to bait Silas into saying something aggressive or uneducated for the clicks. Silas, being the tactical genius he is, decided to lean into the performance art of it all, so he had us set up what he called Phase 2, the haunting of Blackwood Ridge, where we hid motion-activated speakers in the brush that played the sounds of mountain lions screaming and heavy breathing, and we moved some old moss-covered mannequins from the attic into the tree line, dressing them in tattered ghillie suits. When Patricia and her camera crew started their trek into our woods, the forest literally started talking to them, and when Ghillie Man seemingly vanished into the fog after Caleb pulled a hidden pulley system, the cameraman dropped his $5,000 rig and ran for the hills, followed closely by Patricia, who was screaming about occult rituals and mountain witches, The video that actually ended up online wasn't Oppos, T an expose. On us, it was a viral clip of Patricia Thorne tripping over a log and screaming at a plastic mannequin, which turned her into a local laughingstock and pretty much destroyed her authoritative reputation with the HOA board. The last we saw of her was about a month ago when she tried one last desperate attempt to have the county rezone the ridge as a protected wetland, which would have prevented us from hunting or building, but she forgot one crucial detail. The head of the county zoning board was a man whose father had been saved by Silas during a forest fire back in Oppos, 88, and when the board saw the evidence she provided, which was mostly just blurry photos of our menacing scarecrows, they dismissed the case with prejudice and issued her a formal warning for frivolous use of county resources. Peace has finally returned to the ridge. The frogs are louder than the SUVs again, and the only drones we see are the dragonflies over the pond. But every time I see a flash of blue down in the valley, I look at those railroad spikes sitting on the porch, and I wonder if people like her ever truly learn, or if they just find a new mountain to try and flatten with their clipboards. It makes you think, though, in a world where everyone wants to draw lines on a map and tell you what you could do with your own dirt, how far are you willing to go to keep the paved world from swallowing your soul? Would you have played it quiet, or would you have gotten creative like Silas? Because out here, justice doesn't in Oppos. T always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a rusted spike in a forest that knows how to keep a secret, and I'm curious to know if any of you have ever had a fight for your own Blackwood or if you think we're just the backwoods radicals Patricia claimed we were. Either way, the gate in Oppos as closed, the fire in Oppos as hot, and we are in Oppos. T going anywhere.